Yes, I'm really pleased to be here as part of your urban retreat. It's such a wonderful thing to do, to really immerse yourself in the Dharma and in meditation and all the practices that we do here at the London Buddhist Centre, and immerse yourself in those things for a whole week. And to bring Buddhism right into the heart of your environment where you live and work. And it shows us, I think, I remember from, as Varnani said, I used to be in Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I used to work in Sheffield Buddhist Centre, and I remember the urban retreat being a real shift for people because they could see what was possible with Buddhist practice in the heart of their lives. So I was very delighted to be invited to share this evening with you on the urban retreat. Something that's quite close to my heart. In fact, I used to go around Buddhist centres quite a long time ago, introducing the urban retreat to different Buddhist centres around the country and working out with them what an urban retreat would look like in their centres, and that was a great thing to do. So last night, Surya Gupta looked at the ancient path of Buddhism, what we sometimes call the Shravakayana, the way of the hearers. And she really evoked the story of the Buddha. It was very, very beautiful. I wasn't able to be here last night, but I did catch up. And in fact, I was walking through Whitechapel, listening to Surya Gupta evoking the Buddha. I felt a kind of delight, I felt I was in the world of the Buddha in ancient India in Whitechapel. And she really encouraged us to look at the life of the Buddha, to look at those ancient teachings, for example, from the Pali Canon, and to apply them to our lives and to see what really strikes us about the early example of the Buddha, his disciples, and those ancient teachings. I must say, I do love the Pali Canon. I wasn't going to say that, but I'm going to say it now. I've always loved the Pali Canon. It's a work of kind of literary genius in some ways. It's very, very poetic and sometimes very raw, even unpalatable. It's so direct. That's what I think makes people uncomfortable. You sort of want to kind of ease it a little bit. But if you really look deeply into the Pali Canon, it's like a kind of drum beat. And very, very beautiful imagery and verses. So yes, if you're ever interested in finding a way, it's quite large. It takes up about 3 bookshelves in our library at home. And but if you ever wanted a way in, I'd really be happy to share that with you. You might be talking to me for some time. But tonight we're moving from the Shravakayana into something that's called the Mahayana, or the Bodhisattva Yana, which is, the Mahayana means the great way, even the kind of expanded universal way, the way of the beings whose heart and mind is set on enlightenment. And the Mahayana arose out of a problem. It's very similar to the problem that we still face here in our modern lives practicing Buddhism. And the problem that we face, as they faced, it arose about 500, started to arise about 500 years after the Buddha died. And they were facing this problem, which is the Buddha had passed into his parinibbana, which means he'd passed away, he'd died. He'd passed away about 500 years before the Mahayana arose, so that's about 2,500 years ago from now. And they faced this problem that they no longer had him. I know that sounds obvious, but they no longer had him, and he used to be physically present, and the magic that arose out of having the Buddha as physically present with you was no longer available to them. So from the stories of ancient India, we can see that when the Buddha was present, he was able to communicate a lot just by his direct teachings. and by his presence itself. It's said that he shone with this mysterious gold light, and he had a very, very beautiful, serene face. Apparently he was very handsome as well. There's a story that someone once set a mad elephant on the Buddha, and apparently all the townspeople were looking out of their windows to see who was going to win, the Buddha or the elephant. And they were all sighing, saying, "It's such a shame that he's going to die. He's so handsome." Which tells us something a little bit. See, the Pali Canon is not all boring. But yeah, they had this problem that he used to be physically present, and that will communicate something very immediate and direct. One of his main disciples, Ananda, apparently, was attracted to the Buddha just because of his beauty, just because his faculties, they say, were serene and bright. And as Surya Gupta brought out last night, when he talked to you very directly. He could see what that person needs, and he would tell you exactly what you needed. It said that when the Buddha spoke, it was like he was just speaking to you completely individually and no one else was present. And through the example of the Buddha, you could be physically present with what the Buddhist path looked like manifested. There's another story where someone, he was wondering whether the Buddha was the real deal. Okay, he says he's enlightened, he says he's special. Let's see how special he really is. So he went there and he followed him around for 7 months, like a shadow that never departs, which probably was fairly irritating. Would have been irritating to me, but wasn't quite irritating to the Buddha. But he followed him around just to see exactly how the Buddha moved. And apparently he moved with an incredible grace. When he ate, he would eat very, very mindfully with nothing left over. When he washed his bowl, he'd wash it with just the right amount of water and wash it very carefully and mindfully. And the way he walked was so beautiful and steady and communicated so much about the enlightened mind. And all the things he did all throughout the day and the night communicated something about what it was like to live a life with a liberated mind. And the person who's following around thought, at the end of 7 months, I've checked it out, and he really is the real deal. So it must have been quite a thing to be in the presence of the Buddha. But 500 years after he died, it became a collective memory. All they had left were stories passed down through the ages. All they had left was all the stories about all the things that the Buddha did, and all the things that he said were collected in people's minds, memorized and recited every full moon day. So they would get together every full moon and they would just recite everything that they remembered that the Buddha had said. He was recollected in people's minds through symbols. So in those early days, they didn't have figures of the Buddha. They had the Buddha represented by an empty throne underneath a tree, or empty footprints, or my personal favourite, a flame. They just represented the Buddha by a flame. And these were images of presence, of symbolising something to do with the enlightened being, the enlightened mind, but also symbols of absence. It was very apparent to them that the Buddha had walked this earth. He'd walked around northern India, and he had taught the Buddhist teachings. He taught the way to enlightenment. He'd been very present. He'd had this direct communication with people, and now he was gone. And what were they to do with that? What were they to do with the fact that the Buddha was no longer physically present? And I have a certain empathy with their position. I've been looking into that transition period between the Buddha's death and the emergence of the Mahayana. What that early Sangha, that early Buddhist community did with the absence of the Buddha, with the fact that the Buddha had died. And in a way, I think what I'm trying to work out is what we are to do with the fact that our own founder and teacher, Sangharakshita, he's also died. He's no longer present. All the stories about Sangharakshita are becoming memories. They're becoming, in a way, our oral tradition. I was talking to David Mitra about a few of them just earlier this evening, and I love to hear the stories about our teacher and the founder of our order and movement. But you can't go and ask him his advice, you know, and I really feel that very keenly as I take more responsibility personally in the order, that I can't go and ask Sangharakshita's advice just like I used to. It wasn't always easy to be around when you asked his advice. I could tell you probably a few stories about that, but but I trusted him very deeply in what he'd communicate to me, and now it's becoming a memory. It's becoming a memory, and even he's sort of moving out of his historical form of someone that we knew, and he'll soon become a series of stories. You know, it'll become a point where people in the order will never have met him. No one will have met him in the order. So in a way, their questions of the early Buddhists are sort of familiar to me in my own journey as my teacher has died. So the questions that they were asking is, the Buddha has passed, he's passed into his, what they call his final liberation, his final enlightenment. So who is the Buddha to us now that he's gone? And what is his teaching to us? And what is his community to us? So those are the questions that I'd like to look at this evening. And the first is, who is the Buddha to us? Well, he's not physically present. I think we'd get a bit of a shock if he was physically present. He's not physically present. He doesn't wander the streets of Bethnal Green or Whitechapel. He lived in a very different culture and in a different time, in a different landscape, in a different world, northern India, 2,500 years ago. And yet we can imagine him. And as we imagine the Buddha, that has an impact on us. So around 500 years after the Buddha died, we start to get forms, physical forms of the Buddha. But what's interesting is they're not historical forms. They weren't trying to get a kind of photo of what the Buddha must have looked like in their time 500 years before. They were trying to evoke the spiritual qualities of the Buddha himself and what he looked like in their imagination. And if you look at those early figures of the Buddha, often he's actually depicted as a warrior or a ruler. So a kind of very, very sort of strong figure, very powerful figure, very, very broad shoulders. Because they were trying to say, well, for us, the Buddha was confident, he was a sovereign, he was a ruler of his own mind, and he was very potent. He had a very powerful impact on people. So they depicted him as almost like a king. That's probably, he would have had that kind of air about him, but they weren't trying to get what he actually looked like. I mean, what he actually looked like was wearing robes, probably quite rugged, with a shaven head, probably looking quite worn. I mean, he lived his life primarily outdoors. He used to be able to sleep anywhere, they say. He used to sleep on the ground or on the rutted pathways of old roads, which is where the chariots went. He didn't mind sleeping in ditches. So he would have had quite a worn appearance, but as we But the Buddha of the imagination started to take a shape that had a much more kind of sublime countenance and was much more sort of polished. You can see it here. So here we have an image of the Buddha, but this is the Buddha of the imagination. The Buddha of history probably didn't have completely black curls in a nice kind of haircut. He would have had his head shaved, and then that would have grown out a bit to be a bit stubbly. He didn't actually literally have a little bump on his head called the Yoshnisha, and you might have seen a flame on top of his head, but you might well not have seen a flame on top of his head. But that doesn't matter. We're not trying to get a historical form of the Buddha. The Mahayana started to imagine what the Buddha would look like archetypally or imaginatively. And in a way, what you can see with a figure like that is you can see the qualities of enlightenment itself and even the qualities of meditation. So the Buddha seated in meditation, he has a very grounded aspect. It's a very beautiful image of the Buddha himself here. Literally, the Buddha wouldn't have sat in a lotus. I don't think that there's a lotus big enough to sit in, and if you did sit in it, it might well sink. But here we have the Buddha in the imagination, sits in this beautiful lotus on a moon mat, a mat made from the light of the moon. He's golden, he's grounded, he's very calm in his countenance, but very upright, very serene, very energetic. And if you keep looking at Buddha, it will have an effect on you. If you keep imagining that form of the Buddha, it will have an effect on you. I was just experimenting in the meditation before the tea break by occasionally in meditation just opening my eyes and taking in the form of the Buddha and then closing my eyes and seeing what effect it had on me. Well, what effect it had on me was I started to feel a bit like that. I started to feel calmer and more energetic, more upright. I realised I was slouching a little bit. I started to feel, we were doing the Metta Bhavana, and I started to feel that sort of radiating, almost like there was light moving beyond my skin. So what the Mahayana was saying was that the spiritual principle that the Buddha represents is more important to us than his historical reality. So they universalized the Buddha. They took him out of his kind of historical context of 2,500 years ago in northern India, and they brought him out into his symbolic form, emphasizing what he represented, what the qualities of his mind were like, and they universalized it, saying this is who the Buddha is, not in northern India 2,500 years ago, or 500 years ago as it was, but what he is in us, in our imagination, what he represents, not located in a particular space and time, but archetypal, what he symbolizes. And as they did this, they didn't just imagine one Buddha in northern India 2,500 years ago, in that particular culture, in that space and time. They even imagined, like, the spiritual principle of the Buddha isn't confined to the historical Buddha, it's universal. It applies to all of us. In fact, there's not just one Buddha, there's many Buddha. That Buddhas will manifest whenever the conditions are ripe. Whenever conditions are ripe, enlightenment will manifest in humanity. So there's not just one Buddha, there's many, many Buddhas. And they started to imagine all these Buddha forms in these kind of symbolic lands which weren't located anywhere or at any time, these pure lands like Sukhavati, the pure land of lotuses, the happy land, where there's a Buddha inside every lotus just waiting to emerge, and Buddhas are constantly there preaching the Buddha's teaching. The Buddhas are there on lion thrones underneath jewelled trees. So you can see that they're leaving behind the historical Buddha located in space and time and trying to communicate something about Buddhahood itself, that it is available to us and that whenever conditions are ripe, Buddha will arise. They even didn't limit Buddhahood itself to the form of the Buddha. So they had different archetypal forms that represented different aspects, different facets of the enlightened consciousness. For example, they imagined the compassionate aspect of the enlightened mind as a green figure of a woman with one hand to her heart holding a spray of 3 lotuses, her right hand stretching out in a gesture of generosity to all beings, and her right foot reaching out, stepping off her lotus and into the world. They didn't mean that there really was a green lady stepping off a lotus and holding 3 lotus blossoms. They weren't trying to say something about a historical person. They were saying, look, this is what the enlightened consciousness looks like. This is a facet. And if you dwell on this facet of the enlightened mind, which looks a bit like this, you'll start to develop that facet of the enlightened mind. When you're in the Buddha's pilgrimage place where the Buddha gained enlightenment, there's a great temple there at the spot where the Buddha was seated when he saw into the nature of reality. And around that temple are all these archetypal forms, and you can go and walk round and round all these different archetypal manifestations of the Buddha. Sometimes they're Buddha figures, but they're not quite the historical Buddha. Sometimes they're red or green or blue, and they've got different hand gestures. Sometimes they're female figures. Sometimes they look like young princes. But they're all trying to communicate something about the qualities of enlightenment, the different qualities of enlightenment. And then Mahayana said, if you dwell on those qualities of enlightenment, you become those qualities of enlightenment. Which means that when we join the Triratna Buddhist order, we take on one of those figures and we meditate on it again and again and again. I've spent 20 years meditating pretty much daily on the figure of Vajratara, who represents the Buddha's compassion, but also equanimity, the compassion that sees with wisdom. And as you do that, it starts to affect your consciousness. I start in some mysterious way to become those qualities of enlightenment. So what's the significance for us in this archetypal Buddha form on our urban retreat? You know, it's all rather fantastical and wonderful, and if you've got a very vivid imagination like me, you can get really quite lost in those figures. And sometimes it's good to bring it back and say, well, what does this mean for me? Here you are on your urban retreat. What does the cosmic Buddha mean to you? And I'd like to suggest that maybe on this urban retreat, you just allow yourself to be moved by the Buddha of the imagination. Allow yourself to dwell on those Buddha forms, or bodhisattva, archetypal bodhisattva forms, and see what impact they have on you. It might be that you come to the London Buddhist Centre and you really look at this Buddha and you really feel in your way into what this Buddha represents about meditation and about what's possible for humanity. Sometimes it's very easy when you get familiar with a particular shrine room, you just sort of walk in and sort of have a cursory bow to the shrine and then think about yourself again. Settle yourself down, get into my meditation. But if you look at this Buddha form, it will have an effect, and sometimes it will bring you out of those kind of closed sense of, there's a closed sense of me, myself and I, that we all begin with meditation, and into something quite different. Maybe you could even ask yourself, what does it mean that the Buddha's sitting on a lotus? Like, why is that a Buddhist image? What does that try and communicate about the potential of human beings, that the Buddha is seated on a lotus, on a mat made from the light of the moon? You can have that reflection, you can go a long way for a long time. What's the significance of the Buddha sitting on a lotus, this enlightened being sitting on a lotus? And as we imagine the Buddha, we imagine him, yes, as beyond us, and yet something we feel deeply familiar with. It's a peculiar experience. In the words of Wallace Stevens, he's beyond us, yet ourselves. And we can also see those qualities in other people. I think it's a good exercise. We were talking actually at the sub-30s on, is it sub-30 or sub-25? I can't remember. Anyway, younger than me. We had a group on Sunday, and we were talking about the people that we admire. So it's also important on this urban retreat to look at people you admire, to see, you know, what qualities do they represent, and to really feel they're your own emergent qualities. Because they're in qualities that inspire us in other people as something that's in us, that's waiting to emerge, that's it's not separate from us. It's not something that we're bringing into being out of nothing. It's something that we feel ourselves, and that's emerging in us. And it's the same with the Buddha. We feel the image of the Buddha. We're moved by the image of the Buddha because he represents our own emergent qualities. It's not separate from us in some way. So no, he's not here to give direct advice, but there is the Buddha of the imagination, and in that Buddha of the imagination we can contact the Buddha of reality. So there's the Buddha, and there's the Buddha's teaching. So originally the teaching of the Buddha was a direct oral communication that was very tailored to the individual. It was given in a particular place and time to a particular individual. And about 500 years after the Buddha died, it had remained an oral tradition, as I said, and then it was written down. It started to be written down and formalised. And as it was written down, there's a great advantage to this because the teaching is preserved. They started to develop a very scholastic tradition which would write down all the teachings of the Buddha that anyone could remember, and all the stories of the Buddha that anyone could remember. They wrote it down in different groups. So you have groups of teachings of the Buddha, and you have groups of the lists that the Buddha gave in his teachings, and you had the group of all the connected discourse, so everything he ever said to the nuns, for example, or the monks, or to gods or to goddesses, everything that he ever said about gaining insight, all those things. There's a chapter which I'm very fond of called No Discoverable Beginning. It's quite good actually. You can find these little sort of random groups of talks from the Buddha in quite random collections. Anyway, so there's a whole chapter on No Discoverable Beginning. You can look it up. Everything that he ever said to demons. So all of the teachings of the Buddha, they became formalised over time, which had the advantage of preserving the tradition, and we can still read them, which is incredible, really. We can still read those teachings of the Buddha written down. But the disadvantage is that then you can make an intellectual discipline out of it. And having studied Buddhist philosophy myself at university, I know how much you can make an intellectual discipline out of the Buddha's teachings. And as you do so, not let them affect you at all. So you can write all sorts of essays. I remember one of them called is Shunyata a negative critique of substantialist theories, or does it have an objective basis? That was useful for the rest of my life. So you can write really, I read that the other day and I thought, gosh, I don't actually understand a word of my own essay from when I was an undergraduate. So you can see the Buddha's teaching as fixed in a particular time and space that's very interesting. It's very interesting. But the Buddha's teachings are more than what happened in ancient India. They're the direct communication from the enlightened mind, from the liberated mind to us. And the Mahayana said they're not just what's written down in these collections of teachings. They're the stream of spiritual influence from the Buddha. And they said the stream of spiritual influence from the Buddha is always happening. They had this wonderful image, truth, myth, whatever it was. They said, look, it's not just that the Buddha's been and gone and his writings are now written down and you've got to study them. They said the Buddha is constantly preaching the truth on the Vulture's Peak. Now the Vulture's Peak exists. I was there earlier this year. And it's where the Buddha went when he wanted to slightly get rid of everyone else and go on retreat. So occasionally he'd go on retreats and he'd climb up into the mountain onto Vulture's Peak. Vulture's Peak because apparently it had at that time, doesn't really anymore, it had a lot of vultures. At the moment it has a lot of monkeys who will basically steal anything if you leave it lying around. So probably he didn't have as many monkeys in those days, but he did have vultures. And what I was considering while I was up there was, why is it that the Mahayana tradition, the early Buddhist tradition, chose this place as where the Buddha is constantly preaching the truth? And I think it's an image of the Buddha on retreat, in touch with something very vivid and vital in his own mind, in touch with something that's timeless and placeless. It's in a vast place. It looks over the ripple of hills of that area. It's in a big sky above him, a big view, and it's a wild place. He's not in the city. He's not located in that particular place and those particular people at that particular time and all the concerns that they have. He's looking up into the sky, and in some ways the sky feels timeless and placeless. He's in touch with that vastness of consciousness, and it's from there that he's constantly communicating to us. And the Mahayana said if someone can pick up on that spiritual influence coming from that archetypal place, the Vulture's Peak, that timeless, placeless place, that timeless, placeless Buddha, if someone picks up on the spiritual stream of spiritual influence from that place, they can write down what they've heard from the Buddha, and then we can listen to that as well. So they had a whole collection of Buddhist teachings that weren't meant to be historical, but were the words of the liberated mind. These particular Buddhist teachings don't have an author. So then they never said like, well, so-and-so had a kind of vision of the Buddha at this time and he wrote it down in this way. They don't have an author in those ways, most of them. Some of them do. But what they represent is someone who's in touch with a stream of spiritual influence from the Buddha. And they've written it down, so you're not limited by the historical word of the Buddha. You're anything that's from that vast consciousness is the word of the enlightened mind. So what's the significance for us on this urban retreat? Well, I suppose it's noticing when you might be in contact with that vast mind. In all the array of the Buddha's teachings, any Buddhist teachings that inspire you, copy them out and learn them. That will be the traditional Mahayana approach. If there's something that inspires you, where you start to feel in touch with the Buddha eternally preaching the truth from the vulture's peak, then keep that in your heart and turn it over in your mind again and again. And I was going to say any teachings that inspire you, but I think I want to keep it to Buddhist teachings, and this is why. I think that modern wisdom teachings can often slip into platitudes. So they might be in touch with a vast mind, but they might well not be. And in a way, if you keep it to the Buddhist teachings, wherever they're from, you've got a kind of safety net. You've got a bit of surety that they are coming from the vast mind. Sometimes it's not always that easy to tell. But I think if you dwell on the Buddhist teachings, then you're more likely to be in touch with that vast mind. Buddhist truths are very challenging. And they challenge a habitual, easy, self-comforting construction. They're not easy. Buddhist teachings aren't always easy to hear. We heard a little bit about that during the meditation. They're not always comforting, as we said. They're not always a warm bath. Sometimes they're a cold shower. You can't make a meme out of the Buddhist teachings, not really. Actually, just for fun, on my way here, I started to look up Buddhist memes, and these kind of wisdom teachings from Instagram. And there was one I found that said, "Invest in yourself, meditate, read, eat healthy food, drink water, move your body, spend time in nature, rest up. You are worthy." And then it says the Buddha. Now, I've studied quite a lot of the Buddhist and I've got to tell you, I really don't think he said that. Apart from anything else, he didn't read. So it's unlikely that he would advise other people to read. I've got a joke with my best friend, who's not a Buddhist actually, but she sometimes checks out with me Buddhist memes. She said, "Did the Buddha ever say this?" And I say no. And then I say things like, and then she said, "Oh, go give me a quote from the Buddha." And I say something like, "Others do not realise that we are all headed for death. Those who do realise it will compose their quarrels." And then she makes me a little Buddhist meme, a little kind of gentle ripple on a lake. "Others do not realise we're all heading for death." So what I'd like to advise you to do is don't choose the easy, comforting reflection. Choose the reflection that you don't really want. Choose the hard one, the one that uninvited sticks in your mind. And maybe try and reflect for yourself, is that teaching, can I imagine that teaching coming from the vulture's peak, from this wild, rugged Buddha eternally preaching the truth? When I hear this Buddhist teaching, am I there with the Buddha on the vulture's peak? So that's what this teaching meant to the Mahayana, to that community of Buddhists. But there's also what does his community mean to us? So originally, the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddhist community, was identified with the monastic Sangha, people who'd taken monastic vows of celibacy and homelessness and followed the Buddhas, the wanderers, the people who lived off alms, which really means the people who lived from begging. But the Mahayana broadened that out. Well, the Buddhist community isn't just those people who've taken those particular vows, it's anyone who has a serious commitment to the path, anyone who's got a serious commitment to enlightenment itself. And that Mahayana movement went back to the life of the Buddha. And then not just the life of this Buddha, but the life that he'd lived in previous existence. You've got to understand that they, as the Buddhist tradition does, believed in rebirth. And they went back in time to where the Buddha originally started out on the path. And that wasn't just this lifetime, or his lifetime, 2,500 years ago. It was actually in unthinkable time before that. And it's said that at that time he was a matted hair ascetic who lived in the mountains, mountains that look remarkably like the Himalayas, but in a previous world system beyond time. And in that world system there'd been a Buddha called Dipankara, and this matted hair ascetic, Sumedha, had met that Buddha and realised that even though he lived in a cave in the Himalayas, that he was seriously practiced in meditation, that he'd achieved quite high meditative states in his cave, on retreat, it wasn't enough. And he realised that it wasn't enough for him just to liberate his own mind, his own consciousness, that actually what he needed to do was become a Buddha in future times and make the path of Buddhahood available to other people. He realised that this Buddha Dipankara would pass away and his teachings would be forgotten. And then in future world systems, in future times, people would need someone to be a Buddha again. And this ascetic, this matted hair ascetic Sumedha, vowed that he would be that Buddha in future times and make the Buddhist teaching, make enlightenment available for others. So when the Buddha, this ascetic Sumedha, had many lifetimes, which they describe in great detail, when he eventually became what we know as Siddhartha Gautama and then Shakyamuni Buddha, he made, by his own enlightenment, he made enlightenment possible for other people. Something happened when he saw into the nature of reality, which sort of shifted the possibilities of existence, not just for those people at that time, but even for us here now. The fact that Siddhartha Gautama became Shakyamuni Buddha, gained insight into reality itself, developed unlimited love, made that possible for us. The Buddha himself said he'd rediscovered an ancient pathway leading to an ancient city, and it was up to us to follow. So he'd made it possible. He made it possible for them 2,500 years ago. He's made it possible for us. But it will die out. And who's going to do that for the next world system? You can see that Mahayana Buddhists, they think very, very big. They don't just think in this world system. They think in other world systems. They think in future generations. They think in future lives. Who's going to make that possible for future generations, future world systems even? Who's going to continue the work that Shakyamuni Buddha has started? Who's going to perform his function in world systems to come? Where's the next Buddha going to come from? Because whenever conditions are right, whenever they're ripe, a Buddha will appear. So who's going to be the next Buddha? So these early Buddhists in the Mahayana tradition, in the Bodhisattvayana, said, well, we're going to take an elite path of training and we'll be a Buddha in future times. So this is how the movement actually started. They took the vow to be a Buddha in future times. And the Buddhist community were all those people who took that vow to be a Buddha in a future time by training themselves so that they'd be reborn again and again and again, and then in a future system they could be a Buddha. And the Buddhist community were those people, those sort of elite training people, but they're also anyone who's got that kind of attitude of practicing not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of others. They saw that there's a tendency within Buddhism to become a little bit self-focused, which is ironic because it is also about leaving behind self-preoccupation. But they saw there was a tendency in Buddhism to become a little bit enclosed in me and my mental states. That meditation can sometimes take on that enclosed flavour. So the Buddhist community becomes all those who are willing to practice the Buddhist path, not just for themselves, but for other people, who are able to practice diligently and make that Buddhist practice available for other people. So what's the significance for us on this urban retreat? There's a story about one of the members of our order who went to one of Sangharakshita's teachers called Chatrul Rinpoche, and he said to him, "How do I know if my practice is really effective?" And he said, "Because you do it for other people." Very, very simple advice, but it shows this kind of attitude. And the attitude is that my practice is not just my practice, because as I transform my own mental states, not only am I influencing other people positively, it's much easier to live with someone and work with someone who's meditating, who's in good, positive mental states, than it is with someone who's not meditating, who's hung over, for example. So it's much better. If I practice on developing positive mental states, I'll have a positive impact on others. But also I'll make that possible for other people, because I'll show a sort of example of what can be done with the mind. I'll introduce the possibility of real spiritual progress. And we can all do that. So sometimes what I'd like to suggest that you do on this urban retreat is that before you meditate, gather that motivation that what I'm going to do is going to be of benefit to others, and start your meditation with that motivation. What I'm doing here will be of benefit to others. And see how that affects what you do. Something can be produced, something can come into being when we all practice together, and when we cultivate something of metta, of loving kindness, of wisdom, of energy together, that's greater than just us, and other people can participate in that. That's why we're not trying here to just have meditation from an app. We're coming together. You've all chose to come to this shrine room and meditate together and practice together and discuss the Dharma together, because something is created amongst us that's greater than the sum of its parts, that other people can participate in, and that has an effect on others. So just before we meditate, just recollect, this is not just my meditation. And maybe even to bring to mind the people who you know it will affect. And also bring to mind each other. Well, I'm doing it for all of us, because all of us collectively practicing will have a substantial impact on not just us, but others and the world. So I hope you've got a sort of sense of the feel of the Mahayana, the Bodhisattva Yana, this later tradition, this kind of cosmic Buddhism that universalizes not only the Buddha, but the Buddha's teaching in the Buddhist community in a much, much grander scale, in such a big universal scale that it includes us. And we can really take the lesson from that tradition by letting ourselves be moved by the Buddha of the imagination. reflecting on all the Buddhist tradition and all the teachings that inspire us, and having this attitude of practicing for others, with others, and seeing practice as a collective endeavour and not just something to do with us as individuals.